then basically I'm just kind of feeling out where we're going, and so. Welcome, welcome, welcome to Health Issues. I'm your host, Chris Sylvain, and we have Miss Maggie Merrill. She's with the Housing Authority of New Orleans, and we're here to talk about housing, and it's so key to everybody. Thank you, Miss Merrill.
Thank you.
All right, we're excited to have you. Let's start right quickly into something that's been in the news lately, and it's concerning individuals that are that have been incarcerated or whatever, have criminal issues, and they want to move into the Section 8 or public housing. Give us some background on that.
All right, so HANO has recently proposed to change its criminal background policy, and we had created a draft policy statement. We had it on our website, we had a public hearing, and we've been receiving public comment about it. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to create an even playing field and say to people that regardless of what your criminal history has been, that you at least have an equal chance to either be employed at HANO or to live in HANO housing. And so the reality is that our policy in the past had said we look back at your criminal history and you have a possibility to live here, but the reality is that that's not what was happening in practice. Okay. We would take a look back. If people had a felony, had some conviction in their past, they were pretty much automatically denied employment or housing. And so what we wanted to be able to say is make a real positive statement that we're changing our practices, we're reiterating and reaffirming our policy, that we want to create an equal playing field for people in the employment arena as well as in the housing arena. So we created that draft policy to try to make that statement.
Okay, so you did know the controversy that it would create when you created the policy, right?
Yeah, well, I think that it's a controversial issue nationwide, not just in New Orleans, and not just with the Housing Authority of New Orleans, but this concept that there are people that are typically, that enter the criminal justice system, and often disproportionately, if you're a young black male, you're much more likely to go to jail. You're much more likely to be convicted. And then the reality is when you come back out, your options are severely limited, and there are barriers there for you, whether it's for employment or for housing. And so it's a controversial issue nationwide because I think we all understand that that's the case. But at the same time, people aren't necessarily willing to step out and try to make a difference about that, and that's what HANO is trying to do. So, like I said, I don't think that it's controversial just in New Orleans. It would be controversial anywhere, that we're actually trying to say, we understand you've done your time, you've paid your debt to society, and we want to give you a chance to either live at HANO or to be employed by HANO, because we understand the barriers that you face, and that frankly that HANO had potentially been a part of those barriers in the past, and we don't want to be a part of those barriers anymore. Okay, well, let's look at it, applaud it, but let's look at both sides, sure.
All right? All right, I'm paying $900 a month rent, market rate, okay? My neighbor, and I'm paying $900 because I want a nice place, I want a safe place. But my neighbor's paying $125 a month. And so I'm fighting this policy.
Right. So, and that's a typical gut reaction that I think that a lot of market rate renters would have. But let me explain a little bit more what we're planning on doing with our policy. So we are proposing to create a panel of high senior level HANO staff that will evaluate objective criteria for each of these applicants, that is going to hopefully evaluate what their risk would be for continuing to commit crime, or what their potential is to be productive members and to have been rehabilitated in some way. So we want to review that and try to make that decision before either accepting somebody or denying somebody for employment or for housing. So the policy doesn't just say, we're throwing the barn doors open and all former felons or people who have been convicted, you're welcome in. There will still be an admission process, and there'll still be a screening process, but we are hoping to develop some objective criteria that we can evaluate someone's risk for continuing to be dangerous or not, so we can make a much more informed decision. And the reality is I think everybody deserves a second chance, and that's what we're trying to do with this policy. Now, at the same time, we still have very strict criteria for once you make it into the housing. So this is for admissions purposes. But once you're there, if you commit a crime, if you're dealing drugs, any of those sorts of things, you will be evicted from that property, and you are not going to. We're not talking about, you know, being lenient along those lines. And those are the things that I think will help market rate tenants feel safe. And in fact, HANO does that at this point anyway with our mixed income communities, is that when there is when somebody commits a crime or when there's something dangerous going on, those people are evicted from those apartments, so they can't continue to pose a threat to the community. Yeah,
but you mentioned about you know, applying, but for the most part, you know, we were talking about it earlier, there's been a waiting list from however way before Katrina, where other than a few units being open here and there, for the most part, are we really talking about people moving in with somebody who already has an apartment? Is that 98 or 95% of this issue?
I don't know the percentage.
Yeah, we don't, I mean, just in general. Anyway,
but you're right. So there are two ways to look at this. It would be for new people that are applying, and you're right that there aren't, you know, thousands of units that are open right now. But as we redevelop communities, like for instance Iberville that we're working on right now, there will be new units that are created. So we are talking about new admissions. But you also bring up a very important point, that there are families who have sons and daughters who are leaving prison, who have nowhere to live, they need somewhere to stay, they want to be reunited with their families, and that is one thing that we are also looking at with this policy. So it's not necessarily just new people moving in, but it could also be people who want to come rejoin their families and live in the community.
What about husbands, boyfriends, girlfriends?
Same thing, as long as they would be on the lease, and that's the key with public housing and Section 8 as well.
So other people can live there, but they don't have to be on the lease.
No,
so
you can't live there unless you're
on the lease. So
that's
everybody
right.
who lives there has to be on
That's
the
right.
lease. So over what, 24 hours somebody can stay in?
No, I don't know the exact time.
Yeah,
it's
just
maybe
it doesn't
a
matter.
week
It's
or two,
irrelevant.
Right.
I mean, later it is, but for this particular conversation,
but the purpose is to be able to say because in reality, people come back and stay. We know that happens. But what we want to be able to do is say you have an opportunity to add this person to the list, so you don't have to be afraid about somebody finding out that you have somebody living with you, or, you know, it's those sorts of things that we want to try to avoid. This could actually be much safer for the community because you know who's living there. You know that they've been admitted because, you know, they've passed the screening and they've been admitted, and that they are living with their family members. Okay, we're going to balance this out, and trust me, I think She'll knows where I'm going with this. But for, again, a market rate person, was it misadvertised to them when they originally signed their lease for the $900 a month apartment with market rate in mixed income housing would be? Because obviously, again, if they're spending that money, they have a 2-year lease, you know, there's certain so
everybody,
when you're in a mixed income community, whether it's market rate, tax credit, or public housing units, they all have the same criteria. So you all have the same admissions criteria. You all have the same lease terms. So anybody who signs, you know, a public housing lease, or if they sign a market rate lease, they still have all the same terms that they have to abide by. So, you know, so I think that in the reality, everybody still is being held to the same standards when you're in the apartment. So I don't think that it's not a misleading in any way of that there are different standards. They are the same lease terms for everybody.
But they're mad.
Who's mad?
I mean, that people are protesting about, you know, the policy.
Okay, well, you know, we had a public hearing a couple weeks ago, and most of the comment that all of the comment that we had at the public meeting had to do actually with people on the other side who thought we weren't going far enough with our policy. What I've heard from some of our property managers is that their concern is that we need to have some objective criteria in order to be able to evaluate someone's risk if they've had a criminal background. And that's what we have explored, and that's what we're looking into doing. And it makes sense, because you don't want to make an arbitrary decision about, you know, one person's ability to live in a community and then flip in the next day, say yes to one person and say no to another person, without having some objective criteria to say, you know, this is why we're making this decision.
But the question, I guess, now let's flip to the other side.
So if we have the objective criteria, I think it is much more, we're much more able to say, this is what we looked at. These are indicators that show that, you know, if this person was convicted 20 years ago of some crime, that they're not likely to commit it again, and that they're not a risk to this community. Okay, but all right, I'm gonna go again, because we look at it from a health perspective, general perspective.
how can HANO do that? How can HANO, what gives you guys the ability, and I know your background is in public health and so forth, so that's different, but you didn't have to have a background in public health to work for HANO, and your job with HANO is not specifically public health. So the idea of evaluating somebody's potential for committing a crime, to me, that's a highly specialized field of psychiatry, social work, or in a mental health field. That
criminal justice research, yes.
Criminal justice research that so highly specialized is not exact, and the best of the best have trouble making those decisions. So for the housing authority to kind of go there, help me out. I mean, you're public health,
you're right.
so help me out.
It's a great question.
It's
a wonderful question. Let me tell you what we've done.
Some office
I'm going to tell you who our gurus are.
All
Let me tell you.
You go ahead. Let's see.
So we have recently started working with a group called the Vera Institute of Justice.
Yeah, we had them over here the other day.
Okay, good. You know Vera. And you know what they've done with their pretrial screening program.
Ask them the same question. What gurus do they have to create that?
Well, they're our criminal justice gurus, because you're right. HANO doesn't have...
So we're going nowhere to nowhere. We're going from zero to zero.
Well, I don't think I would characterize it that way. I think the Vera Institute has a very good track record and history of the work that they do. But you're right that HANO does not have any, well, I can't say we don't have experience. We do have a police department, and so our chief of police is very experienced in the criminal justice system. But from a policy decision making, you're right, HANO is a housing agency. We're not a criminal justice agency. So what we are doing is we're working with people who have that expertise in the criminal justice system, and the Vera Institute being one, that can help do the research for us, that can help make recommendations for us for the types of risk factors that we should be looking at, and they can help us create some sort of evaluation tool that we can then use to evaluate that risk.
I'm excited about it, but I'm just saying, John Wool, he was just here, and we spoke to him, and the same question that we had is that, again, from a health perspective, and I asked him as well, I mean, fantastic, great legal mind, but that evaluating an individual. Say, I'm a young African-American male. I'm still young. That's right, 54. All right, and I know what it's like when I was coming up. I'm arrested, which was very easy. You know, so many of my friends were arrested. I've been in jail. The person that would decide my history, we were just dealing with Clemmy Greenlee and prostitutes, you know, working the streets, sex trafficking and so forth. Every issue, sex trafficking, prostitution, homelessness, we had, when we focused on that, homelessness, sex trafficking, prostitution, everything is literally housing based. It's all based upon housing. And believe me, I'm not hitting you guys. I applaud what y'all are doing.
Your ability
I think
to have housing or not have housing.
Yeah, no, I'm excited about it. But to me, same argument. We wouldn't have the prostitution issue if we had housing. We wouldn't have the homeless issue if we had housing. Well, I'm committed a crime. I would like somebody in my corner who can truly evaluate me. The same argument I had with Mr. Wool with the Vera Institute, that to me, that should be Ochsner, Tulane, you know, LSU, not to be partisan in any of the hospitals, but that the clinical psychologists, and I challenge them in that area that from a governmental standpoint, and again, this is not Mr. Gilmore or your group, so we're not hitting you guys, but just from a practical standpoint, I would like to see the hospitals attempt to make that decision. What's your thoughts there? Hey, you're Tulane, come on, help me out.
Well, I don't think this show is long enough to talk about the lack of mental health care in the state of Louisiana.
There we go.
But that is certainly an issue. But I will say that what we're not trying to do is do psychological review of every single individual. I think that there is a way to create evaluation tools that predict with probabilities, and that's what we're trying to do. And as you know, anybody who knows science knows that there are always cases that will be judged incorrectly and cases that will slip through. But what we're trying to do is make a best judgment on all of the factors for the majority of people. And I think that there are ways that you can design evaluation tools that do that. And look, everybody knows that some people are going to slip through the cracks, and that's unfortunate. What we're trying to do is make something that has as high a probability as possible.
Okay, I'll leave that alone.
Yeah.
All right.
I mean, it's true. That's how science works, right? You can't predict every single thing in the world. If I could, I would need a job.
Yeah, but that's not the question. Is who's doing the predicting? And that's
well,
my challenge.
No, so the process would be that the Vera Institute would help HANO to design an instrument that would look at all of the different various risk factors from a criminal background and a criminal justice system standpoint, and may even recommend others that we can do research on and look at. But then it's ultimately HANO's decision. So HANO will be using these tools and then reviewing it, because what HANO does have is expertise in and experience in housing, specifically with public housing and with Section 8. So we get the help from the experts with the experience on the criminal justice side, but ultimately HANO uses that. We evaluate and we make the final decision based on not only this expert opinion, but also our experience in the housing field.
Okay, good. And that same question, I'll refer back to the same conversations with Mr. Wool. I don't think that they have I won't say that they don't have the expertise, but I challenge them taking upon that role. Again, from a health perspective, that health is health, criminal justice is criminal justice, housing is housing, and I think everybody has to stay in their lane.
Sure.
I think what happens is, I think we're shifting lanes here, all right? And health is not even solid there. So I think everybody needs to stay in their lane. So let's leave that alone, because that's a bigger issue. But the bigger concept, why do we care anyway? Why aren't we, the fact, again, if I'm homeless, if I need help, again, that's what we're talking about. The issue, girls are going out becoming prostitutes because they can't get housing, because once they've had a criminal issued, and then there's no Section 8. And so to me, the whole Bourbon Street issue, and that's, I mean, not getting into the moral implications of it, but the whole idea of prostitution, sex trafficking, the whole idea of drug addiction, and these guys, you know, we're at the prison dealing with going to prison, everything is based upon, hey, I don't want my mama homeless, you know, so that's a major thing for a boy. I don't want my mama to be homeless. I mean, you know, so why are we, I guess my biggest thing is, why are we even concerned with that? Why don't we just try and provide the best housing we can, give everybody a number, and let them come on in?
Well, I think your example just pointed out the situation very clearly, which is that it's all interlinked. All of this stuff relates to each other. Now, HANO does the housing side, but I think what we're trying to do is say, let's look at the supportive services side, let's look at the social side. Even though housing is the thing that we provide, how do we start making an impact on this situation with the resources we have, which is a housing resource, but understanding how it's all interconnected. And your question is, why do we care? No,
I mean, again, to me it's utter, I'm gonna be honest with you, it's utter discriminatory to look at the criminal psychological profile. It's like, wait, I just need a place to stay. Oh, okay. Why I can't take a number? You know, I pull a number. Why do we even care about what your criminal background is? Yeah, I mean, once we get in, this is a criteria. But before we get in, now, if I had been expelled from another, you know, housing institution, but again, if I've done my debt to society, if I'm not in jail, obviously people feel I can be out of jail.
That's right. Absolutely. No, you're right.
So why can't I go from jail to a house? And that's, I think, what does anybody else feel? Who else? Again, who else thinks? The gall of somebody to think that they're going to look at my background. Right. Well, leave me alone. Just give me a place to stay.
Absolutely. And I think what you're describing is really some of the impetus for why HANO is looking at changing our policy. Because I can tell you that Mr. Gilmore feels exactly the same that you do. Okay. That why do we care what your criminal background is? Now, there are a few, I've got to point out that there are some HUD regulations that if you're a methamphetamine producer or if you're a lifetime sex offender, that that's a HUD, you know, federal law that you can't do it. Right. But that's exactly right. Besides that, why do we really care? Now, there may be, if you are currently committing, you know, if you're dealing drugs or there are other sorts of stuff.
Call the police, then they need to be in.
That's right. So there are things like that. But you're right. That's the impetus, and that's what we're looking at with this policy, is really changing it. Like I said before, we, in our current policy, and what is typically happens across the country, is there's a 7-year look-back period. So we'll look back 7 years in your criminal history to see what you've committed. Right. HANO is looking at changing that drastically. The Section 8 side has a 3-year look-back period. So we're looking at what are we going to do about these look-back periods? Because you're absolutely right. It doesn't really matter what happened 5-10 years ago. What happens is right now, because you want to live here, are you going to be dangerous or not dangerous? That's basically the bottom line. So you're right, and that is part of what we're doing with our policy, is trying to look at those sorts of things about, you know, how far back do we need to look? Obviously, we're only looking at convictions. We're not looking at arrest record. So those are the questions that we're still kind of kicking around, but we are definitely looking at I think that rings very true with the sentiment that we have is why does it really matter?
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, you guys are great improvement. We're going from zero to something, you know what I mean? But I guess it does open the door to philosophical questioning. And in a way, it's a shame because we had nothing before and there were no protests, and it should have been, you know what I mean? And hey, you know, it should have been, we've been screaming about housing for years, but we should have screamed louder. So you guys are doing some, but it does open the door for us, and we're thankful that we're able to have this conversation. Really, really appreciate the whole thing. But it does beg the question of, are we, you know, it's almost like a totalitarian state. Now, I guess the next thing we need to look at too, when we're talking about, you know, somebody in the housing area, what is the criteria to remove them, you know, from housing?
From housing?
Yeah.
It's similar to any other lease that someone would have in a private apartment.
Okay.
When you're in public housing, you have a lease that you sign that has various criteria, and basically if you violate those criteria, just like any lease anywhere, you can be evicted. Okay. I don't know the particulars, but HANO does have a one-strike policy. There are a few crimes, you know, a few things that you can do, such as committing a crime or drug dealing, those sorts of things, that can result in a one-strike eviction.
That's fair.
That's fair. That's fair. Similar for the Section 8 side. Section 8, when you are have a Section 8 voucher, you're basically a private tenant with a private landlord, but you have a voucher, so your rent is being subsidized.
Right.
So you have your own lease with the landlord. So if you violate those terms, the landlord can evict you. There are also some standards of behavior that the voucher brings with it, and you know, things to do with keeping up your apartment, those sorts of things. Right. And if you violate those, a lot of times HANO will counsel you on that and help you to improve those. But it's similar to anything. You have a lease, you have terms, and if you violate those terms, you can be evicted. Okay,
well then that goes back again. Somebody that's homeless, they need a place to stay. Martha Kegel and Unity, we're talking all the time with them about housing and so forth. Do you ever foresee where you guys actually line up your list with Martha Kegel's list, and the priority for housing would be the people that's medically needed? We have people in wheelchairs that are homeless.
We actually have already done that. So in 2010, HANO got a large infusion of about 4,000 vouchers. And in addition to the other 12 or 13,000 that we already had. And as part of those 4,000 vouchers, we had a set aside of 1,100 that went to various institutes like Unity for the Homeless, No AIDS Task Force, groups that dealt with violence against women, domestic violence, and groups that dealt with disability and special needs. And so we've done that in the past, and we continue to do that with Martha and others to look at, you know, to make sure that they have a set aside that they can get these high priority, high need cases into housing. So we do that with Unity and with some of those other agencies.
Hey, we applaud it. To be honest with you, again, we've been dealing with domestic violence, homelessness, you know, John Wool and the Vera Institute, and housing drives everything. And just recently, you know, we're dealing with particularly domestic violence. Women, they stay getting beat because they have nowhere to stay. And who can $900?
Or they're afraid if they report it, for instance, in public housing, that they may be evicted. And which is not the case, but that's the fear, and I think that stops a lot of people from reporting it. Yeah,
but I guess my biggest thing, and don't get me wrong, I've discussed this. I've been everywhere trying to get this information on housing vouchers. Is there any way we can make this whole concept more public? I'm thankful for being on the show, but to let people know kind of what's going on with this.
Well, if you just let me know, give me the information that you want to know,
and I can
exactly
see if I can find it. Okay. No, the bottom line is that, okay, fine. The first people on the waiting list are the most critically needed. Now, I think that that's a social service area that social workers or whoever can make happen to look at who's the most critical needed people.
On our wait list, when you sign up on the wait list, you check off various things, and one of them is if you are homeless. And so if somebody has checked off that they are homeless, they rise in priority in the wait list as well.
All right,
already.
That's important. All right, what about, again, you know, some kind of way it has to be connected again to, I say sex workers. I think that's important. You know, girls that have found themselves, we see it all and over again. Hey, I have to be a sex worker because that's the only way I can support my kids.
That's an area that we haven't looked at directly. And actually another area, it would be a reentry program. coming back to the criminal background policy side.
Yeah, but they wouldn't be on the criminal side. They're just basically have figured out that, and that's what we're hearing all over again, the whole Bourbon Street, all of the dancers and so forth. If they had housing, they would not have to live this kind of lifestyle if they had a place to stay.
Okay. Like I said, we haven't looked at that issue specifically, but we'll take a look at it.
Young men, they wouldn't sell drugs if their mother can have a place to stay. I mean, it just keeps going over and over and over and over again. And so you guys are for it. Just give you the cash, give you the money, from the federal government.
Yeah, that's right. If we got more resources, we'd be happy to provide more housing.
All right, that's fantastic. That's good. Okay, so the next thing we're dealing in is that, again, recognizing the need for housing, the limited need for housing. Is there any way to create probably restating the question, a more equitable policy that's just fair, that allows people to have a house based upon their need, not based upon their criminal background, not based upon their creed, because eventually we're dealing with their culture and everything else like that. Because the criminal issue is based upon culture. We know that African-American males will use less drugs than anybody else, but they're the ones that's getting arrested and convicted and going to jail. Other races use more drugs, but they don't get arrested. So therefore, I know people that were in the St. Bernard housing project, where I grew up in that area, they can't go back and live in the area anymore, and some of them end up being homeless.
Well, so that's exactly why HANO and Mr. Gilmore specifically really felt strongly about changing this criminal background policy. Exactly what you point out is that black men in general are incarcerated at much higher rates, and typically it's because of the color of their skin, not necessarily because of the type of crime that they've committed.
That's right.
And so that's why we are trying to change our criminal background policy to make it more fair and equitable, and to say to everybody, you're on an equal basis, you have an opportunity. Because really, I think what was happening is, regardless of what our policy had been in the past about admissions or employment, is people weren't applying for housing at HANO or for jobs at HANO because they knew that they weren't going to be given a chance, and they knew it wasn't an option.
Can't get blood out of a turnip.
That's right. So that's what we're trying to say now is, you do have a chance, and we're making this an open call to everybody to say, you need to understand that HANO is changing the way that it's looking at things, and you absolutely have a chance to apply. It doesn't mean you're guaranteed admittance. Everybody has to go through a screening process.
That's right.
You may not income qualify. There may be other things that make you unsuitable for housing, or on the employment side, you may not have the skills or qualifications for that job. But purely having a criminal background is not going to be something that keeps you out.
How did we get to that place in the beginning? Who created that? That was before Mr. Gilmore. That was before it was under federal receivership.
Right. I think it's more practice rather than policy. The HANO's admissions and continuing occupancy policy, it's called the ACOP, has been the same for quite some time, and it spells out what the different rules are for being admitted and remaining in a property. And so it has said for quite some time, there's a 7-year look back. It doesn't say specifically in the policy that if you have a conviction, you're automatically barred. It doesn't say that. But in practice, that's what was happening. And so, the policy itself needs to be tweaked, but it's more the practice that we really need to look at and make it clear to all of the employees at HANO, this is how we're administering this program.
Well, we truly, truly hope that we move towards, not based upon the color of our skin or the criminal background, but the content of our character and how they perform in public housing. And there's a list based upon needs, for the elderly first, and the disabled and sick, and those that have found themselves, because housing drives everything. We're excited. I think we're moving on to the last part of the program now. I think for you that are at home, I think more than anything, what we need to understand is that housing is the key. Whatever we can do to get our legislators and so forth to put money into housing, I think we need to make that happen. There's no way we can have health care without housing. There's no way we can have criminal justice without housing. And there's no way we can have a decent society without housing. So I applaud you, Ms. Merrill, for what you're doing. Again, the Masters in Public Health, excited from that background. Keep up the great work. But again, I think we have to push for the money. Fight as hard as you can. Take no prisoners. Health issues.